This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Beth Gregg, founder of Claverton Cloches, who's on a mission to revive the beauty and practicality of Victorian cloche gardening. We talk about cloches of all shapes, sizes and materials, and about how they can extend the growing season and protect crops. We explore the history, design and sustainability of cloches, and why sometimes the smallest structures can make a big difference in the garden.
So I run a company called Claverton Cloches, which is, I suppose, in the name, alluding to my love of all things garden cloche. I am not, which is a good thing to preface at the start of a chat like this, I'm not professionally trained in gardening in any way, shape or form. I'm just someone that loves gardening and really got into gardening in I guess not a serious way, but in a way that is important to me, probably about 7 years ago. Grew up with gardens, but it wasn't something that I worked in. I used to have a very corporate job. And the garden for me was, like most people, a means of escape and a means of kind of connecting with nature and just taking a bit of a breather from the busyness of everyday life. And as I really got into gardening, what I loved the most was that feeling of the real romantic English garden, those sorts of gardens that you visit. I'm talking about the great gardens like Relsham or Chatsworth, where you go and you lose yourself, where you almost feel like the whole world has stood still and it's just you in this garden and you could be existing at any point in time. And I wanted, I guess, a way of bringing that feeling into my own really tiny garden. I live in Bath, so in the centre of Bath. It's really a postage stamp, or it was then. And one way that I thought about doing this was through cloches, because they look like these wonderful Victorian glass houses, but of course they're small and they're portable. And they also are deeply practical. I love growing chillies, or rather I did grow a lot of chillies at the time, and I wanted a way of growing those in my garden where they would really thrive, but without having to put up some sort of small greenhouse or a little plastic polytunnel. I wanted something that looked the part and was also practical. And over the years, my interest in all of these sort of antique garden designs has grown and grown, and that sort of led me on to create cloches as a business. I created, or rather revived, a Victorian cloche for my own garden, and from that, Claverton Cloches was born, and now I send cloches to all corners of the world from my workshop in Bath. So that's sort of a quick history of how I got into what I'm doing now, but I still... I do lots of other products with the business now, but what I love and what the essence of what we do is about cloche gardening. So I'm really excited to talk to you about cloches today and sort of how people can be using them in their garden. Obviously not just the kind of cloches we make, but all cloches as well.
Yeah, I mean, so many questions. So yes, I've never thought, honestly, about growing things like chillies under cloches. I've always had either, greenhouses or polytunnels, that kind of thing. So that in itself is quite exciting because, as you say, you could have a small space and you could grow stuff that you think, that you couldn't possibly do outdoors in the UK. So when you're growing things like chillies, for example, what is it about cloche growing? I'm going to take it really back to basics. What is it about cloche growing that makes them able to thrive in that kind of situation?
Sure. So if we think of a cloche, I suppose, like a miniature greenhouse. I'll probably describe a cloche so that your viewers who maybe haven't seen one before get kind of an idea of it. And so a cloche is it's a French word for a bell, and they originally were these glass domes that French market gardeners were using in the kitchen gardens to create warm microclimates for plants and help them grow more vegetables sooner. And then the Victorians sort of took that idea and added a cast iron frame to make them a bit more sturdy, because those glass bells can be very fragile. So it sort of looks and acts like a miniature greenhouse, with the difference being that you can move it around the garden. So instead of sort of taking your plants in and out or moving them around the greenhouse, you can be planting things directly into the soil and bringing the cloche to them as and when needed. So perhaps you may be using them at the start of the plant's life for germination, or right at the end to protect crops from pests. that's how they're used. And for something like chillies, where they're really, as they sort of start to fruit and you want to really get that heat and life from the sun into the plant, that's where cloches really come in, because you can use them to be creating that nice warm microclimate, really helping that fruit to get as good as possible, really, and of course protect it from anything that might want to nibble on it. A little less likely with the chilli, I appreciate, but that's more appropriate for other plants as well. They're helpful with things like chillies as well, especially when they're quite, they're sort of later varieties. If you've got them planted outside instead of on a windowsill in your house, you can be using cloches to sort of buffer the temperature as the kind of temperatures drop. In September, you can be using a cloche to really extend that growing season.
Yeah, because I think I probably would have previously used them for stuff that's growing earlier in the year, just to give it a bit of warmth whilst it got going before the temperatures kind of truly got up. Because I think I might have assumed that things get a little bit sweaty under cloches as the temperatures go up. Have you got a way of combating that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that you need to be aware of, is that you don't want, especially with the kind of the bell cloches, the sort of French traditional ones, they don't have any built-in ventilation. And there are stories of, French market gardeners in the 17th and 18th century sending people out morning and night to kind of prop open the cloches and then close them again at night before the temperatures dipped, to kind of seal in the warmth of the day. The problem with those cloches is they are really airtight, and then ventilation becomes a problem. And like you say, when they start to get sweaty, you risk things like mildew and molds affecting what's growing under there. Different cloches have different ways of combating that. So some cloches are just sort of a roof and two sides, and they allow a nice through draft to run through. So they're really just good for protecting, keeping things off the top of a plant, but they'll allow good ventilation throughout. The Victorian style of cloches have a removable lid, and those lids can often be kind of offset to 45 degrees. So again, you're getting a lot of the benefit of that microclimate from the sun, but you're still getting a good amount of airflow in there as well. I suppose the flip side is that when the lid is fully on and it's, earlier in the season, you're getting quite a warm environment under there on a sunny day. So pros and cons, I think, there.
And you mentioned as well about the pests. I mean, how effective are they at keeping pests out?
Yeah, this is something I experiment with a lot in my own garden, because there are lots of different garden visitors and they come for different things. So at the moment, I have cloches over some of my spring bulbs. And those are just bulbs that I've got in large containers, and I put a cloche over them because the squirrels just seem to love to come and dig up whatever I've got under there. And it's particularly frustrating when you've carefully selected your bulbs and your colour palettes for spring, and then you realise that only half of them come up because the rest have been eaten. So I use them to protect the bulbs. And the sort of added benefit of that this year as well has been that it's kept a lot of the water off my bulbs as well, because it's been such a wet spring. It's helped to kind of keep the soil underneath a bit drier to stop them from rotting. But I also use cloches later in the season as well over things like strawberries to keep pigeons and birds off. And I think it was the summer before, we had an exceptionally wet spring, and the slugs were just so prolific that I ended up trying to use them at least to, if not completely deflect, but sort of deter the slugs from dahlias that I had in the ground. They always seem to go for those lovely fresh shoots, and I actually put a ring of copper tape around the bottom of the cloche as well. It was pretty helpful. They definitely went for other things in the garden that didn't have a cloche on them, although I'm not sure I would say that a cloche is entirely slug proof, but it certainly did help to defer some things. I know that I spoke to a customer a long time ago, and they actually had peacocks in their garden, which sounds quite ridiculous. And they were using cloches to keep peacocks off their sown brassicas, which I found quite a funny mental image. It's so whimsical.
I mean, is there a temptation to just cloche everything? So I'd be like, oh my God, that's at risk, let's just bung a cloche on it.
They are really effective. Well, I guess one doesn't need a whole garden covered in cloches and doesn't need the expense of that either. But I suppose some things, one has to be careful of. For example, they can be great for doing things like when I sow something like spinach, they can keep the wind off the spinach so that those nice young shoots, nice young leaves are really tender. But the sort of downside of that is that then if you do remove the cloche, they're really susceptible to the wind. And you probably want to then go and employ the cloche elsewhere in the garden. So you kind of, I suppose, don't want to be so reliant on it, or you don't want to mollycoddle your plant underneath so much with a cloche that it becomes actually so reliant on it and it can't grow without that environment. So they're really helpful, I think, at specific periods for different plants, be that extending the growing season at sort of either end of the spring, summer, or protecting against pests, maybe close to harvest. But other than that, I think you also can be leaving stuff uncovered as well.
Yeah. And we spoke about sort of keeping things dry. How do you water things that are under the cloches?
Unless it's very sort of midsummer, in which case I don't really have much under cloches at that time of year because it does tend to get a bit hot and a bit dry. But at other times of the year, I don't specifically lift the cloches up to water, really. I find that there's a bit of condensation produced when it's a hot sunny day, and that will drip down onto the bed. But also because they're open-ended, they don't have a fixed sort of base. They're just sitting straight onto the soil. There's usually a sufficient amount of moisture that's running off the cloche and down into the soil that's sort of making its way through to whatever's growing under there. So it's never really a concern that things underneath are going to completely dry out. I suppose that's also a function of the size of the cloche. At their kind of largest, the largest antique ones I've seen are about 60 centimetres square. So they're not a huge amount of area compared to maybe something like a large cold frame.
Yeah. So thinking of things like cold frames and cloches, you've got fluctuations in temperatures, so things might get very hot in the day and then much chillier at night. With something like a cold frame, you can go and manually lift up the lights, and that's fine because you're kind of probably got a few plants under there. But as you said, if you had a lot of cloches, would you be skipping around the garden morning and night, putting them on, taking them off, or venting them or whatever? How does that work with different styles of cloches?
Yeah, sure. So the bell cloches, they're quite heavy on the level of attention that they need, because if you've something growing under there and you've had a spell of maybe more cloudy weather, but you suddenly get a nice hot sunny day, if you haven't taken that off, what's under there might wilt just because of the complete lack of ventilation. And that's why maybe when you're selecting cloches, it's better to go for something where there is some sort of inbuilt ventilation. It's also, I guess, helpful to think of how you're growing as well. Are you growing in sort of long drills in your kitchen garden, or do you sort of have something here, something there? If you're growing in those big long runs, then it's probably better to be using, it's called a chase cloche or a barn cloche, and they're only covered on two sides. They're open on the other two sides, which means that you can create nice big long runs of them, and they have a good draft running through them. So I would say they're really the sort of lowest maintenance on a day-to-day basis, because you're not running around having to open this and close this. The downside, and there seems to be a pro and a con for everything, the downside of those is that they're such a simple construction. They're just sort of glass panes that they are susceptible to breaking if you're moving around the garden. And then obviously you've got the problem of glass in the garden, which is never very good.
No. And how have you combated that issue with breakage? Because I'm assuming, based on a Victorian design, yours are glazed.
Yeah, they are glazed, exactly. The clever Victorians, who I guess we have to thank for so much in the garden and the way we garden now, but they created these cast iron frames when cast iron was becoming the real material of choice in that period. And cloches, the ones that we make, have this cast iron frame that then individual glass panes are set into and then puttied in, much the way that a sort of pane of glass would be puttied into an old sash window. What that means is the pane of glass is quite a small span. We use horticultural glass, same as what you would find in a greenhouse, but each pane is not, spanning any more than, say, 20 centimetres in one dimension, which means that it's actually relatively thick. And so that cast iron frame and the relatively small size of the glass means that they're actually pretty strong. I know that in the sort of five years that I've been making these, I've only ever had one customer who contacted me saying that he had broken a pane, and we offer free repairs. But it was because he was washing the cloches in a stream, which I found just such a romantic image, washing your cloches for spring in a stream. I thought that was brilliant. So I don't recommend doing that, obviously, with the glass.
No, as picturesque as it may be, maybe not.
Exactly.
If you're using things like plastic cloches, they've got a limited lifespan. Did you think about the sustainability issue as well when you picked your designs and your materials?
Massively. This is a massive driving factor of what I'm doing with Claverton Cloches. When I started getting into gardening, I kind of realised that so many of the tools and apparatus that were out there just weren't really fit for purpose for a long life outside. And so many of them kind of fell apart. Things that I was using were falling apart after 2-3 years of use. I suppose by nature, gardens, they are outside and things do take a lot of use, but there's no reason why they should be made in such a way that they just end up in landfill after a couple of seasons. And that, to me, really feels at odds as to why we even garden in the first place. If the whole exercise is about appreciation of nature and being outdoors and kind of what this planet has to offer us, then it seems mad to be using things that are just going to go into landfill. So sort of from day one, thinking about that sustainable side, making things that really, really last has been incredibly important to me. And so our cloches are made to last not just for our use in our life, but to be used by the next generation as well, which I think is a nice link, because a lot of people speak of getting into gardening from a parent or a grandparent. And it's nice, I suppose, if the tools can travel along that journey as well.
Well, I mean, I think for some people, the barrier to more sustainable products and things that have got a longer life could be cost. But it's an investment, as you say, that I suppose sometimes you have to take the hit and say, OK, well, this thing is not going to go in the bin after 2 years. It's going to last going forward.
Yeah, exactly. I know, I completely appreciate that. And I think of companies maybe like Barber Jacket, where you maybe buy one and it is an expensive outlay, but then that's lasting for your life. And if it does rip, you can get it repaired. If the zip goes, you can get it repaired, and it really will serve you. And I suppose then on a per wear, per use basis, it's more effective as well.
Yeah, I think probably we need to start thinking about that as consumers a lot more. The other thing I was going to ask you is, because you're not using them year round or in the same place year round, you may want to store them. You know, if you had a number, are they fairly easy to store? Can you leave them outside all year round?
You can leave them outside year round, and I suppose some cloche styles, the Victorian ones, they look quite ornamental in the garden. I quite like a sort of that period of August where everything just goes a bit crazy in the kitchen garden and everything is tumbling everywhere. And it's quite nice, I think, to sort of see a little cloche peeping out from under some unruly nasturtiums or tumbling peas. But they can be stored, yeah, of course. With the Victorian ones, the bases sort of come apart so that they can just be stacked up and the lids can be stacked on top of one another as well. But those cloches that I mentioned, the chase cloches, where they're just pieces of glass, they're really efficient to store because it's just 4 pieces of glass and a sort of one small metal bracket that holds it all together. I guess plastic ones can also usually be stacked too. So you can retire them for the summer and then bring them back out in September when you want to start thinking about overwintering.
I once used some very lovely metal cloches in a garden that the garden owner purchased because they were supposed to keep the slugs off of the plants, which they did to a degree. But I remember I've got visions of me stacking them and then trying to get them apart later in the year, and it was a bit of a disaster. I'm assuming your ones are designed to stack and then actually come apart.
Yeah, they do come apart, yeah. But I can imagine the frustration. I've sometimes had calls from people saying that they've maybe discovered or rediscovered some old cloches in a potting shed or a barn, and could I restore them, which I do, but quite often, yeah, they're just in a sort of a muddle of different shapes and sizes, all in a corner, and it's a bit of it's like a puzzle putting them all together again, seeing what goes with what.
God, I can only dream of finding some antique cloches in the garden.
Same. That's like a cloche maker's dream. Going into an old stable block or something, then there's just a big heap of cloches in the corner. I live in hope.
Yeah, I bet. So actually, that brings me nicely onto where you found the design for yours. How many designs do you have? Is it just the one, or have you got kind of multiple?
It's 2 now, actually. Yeah, I've got a square one and an octagonal one. The square one I'd actually seen it at quite a few different gardens throughout the years. I'd seen them in use at Audley End, Inverview up in Scotland. I'd seen them at the Lost Gardens of Helligan. Lots of different gardens where they were actually using them out in the kitchen garden. And I didn't really know what they were at the time, actually. They just caught my eye because they looked quite playful. There's something about the miniature that I think is quite interesting to look at. And so when I decided to make these, I ended up tracking one down at an antique market and brought it carefully home in the car, wrapped in a blanket as if it was a baby. I was so excited. And I've essentially recreated that. It's a like for like reproduction. So actually, even sometimes I'll have people say that they've got an antique one that they've lost a base panel from it, and we can supply one, and it's a like for like design of that. I think the Victorians did such a good job with the design of this that it doesn't really need reworked. I then, a few years later, was at Erdig Hall. It's in North Wales, and I was speaking to the gardeners there, and I talked about cloches, and they said, "Oh, cloches, great. Well, you're going to like what we have back here." And it was exactly one of those moments we spoke about. They brought me back to like a potting shed, and in a dusty corner, they had an incredible collection of antique cloches, and some of them were decagonal, so 10-sided, and one of them was octagonal, 8-sided. And I completely fell in love with how that looked. It was so whimsical and just so Victorian that I thought I have to make one of these. And so I make this 8-sided one now, which was a bit of a mission to work out how to make it, because they're two panes of glass that need to essentially butt up against one another with nothing in between. So that was a bit of head scratching to work out how that's done. But I just love how they look. They look so sort of romantic cottage garden.
Love it. I absolutely love the idea of it. Are you still on the lookout? Do you think you might introduce more designs, or are you kind of happy with where you are now?
No, I probably would. I'm always on the lookout for beautiful old garden tools. And yeah, I would love to create a larger square one, because I think that 60 centimetre one that I spoke about earlier is even more practical, just because you can grow even more underneath it. So I probably will make that one at some point. But I've also been thinking about what other beautiful garden tools I could make as well that are based on designs from days gone by. Again, those Victorians they were so good with their clever designs and use of materials that I just want to make more and more things, or rather bring them back to life so people can use them today and enjoy them, because they tend to nearly always marry practical function with looking nice as well.
Love it. I love the idea of it. I think you're doing great work reviving all this stuff. So yeah, best of luck with it. And I hope everyone sends you the pictures of their antique things they've got knocking about in case something sparks your interest.
Yeah, I hope so as well. And also, I just love receiving photographs of what people are growing under cloches. Like I'm on the cloche growing journey as well. And so I love learning about how else I can use them in my garden to really make the most and grow for longer in the season and grow more as well. And so I love hearing about how people are using them.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Beth for a great interview. If today's episode sparked your curiosity about protecting plants and extending your growing season, you might also enjoy episode 142, Growing Under Cover, and episode 193, Growing Under Protection. You'll find links to both in the show notes. And as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his insect of the week.
Lorelia spinipes, the Narcissus dung fly. Now that common name slightly amuses me, but this is a fly that I didn't actually know about until about a month ago. And this is one of the greatest things about online recording and insect groups, is that somebody posted about this fly and the fact that it is a very, very close association with daffodils, narcissus, and people were mildly excited by it. And there was the implication that if you look at narcissus, you may well find this fly. So that was my mission in the last few weeks. So when the wild narcissus were flowering in one of the gardens that I work on, I thought I'd have a quick look, and lo and behold, there were more than 20 mating pairs on the wild narcissus, the narcissus, pseudo-narcissus, the Tembe daffodil. It was really exciting. I managed to get some good pictures, got the species confirmed online, and another exciting species to my garden list. And that's how it happens sometimes. You don't know anything about the fly. You just hear about it through some other kind of keen recorders or specialists, and you got to look for the plant and the associated insects, and it can possibly be there. So it can be as simple as that, and then you start to unravel the ecology a little bit. This fly is in the dung fly family, as the common name may imply, the Scathophagidae. And as far as I can tell, there's no actual relation with this species with dung, because the larvae mine daffodils mostly. So they mine the leaves of daffodils, and then they pupate near the base of the plant. And once again, this has been a kind of running theme for quite a few of the insects in my Insect of the Week. It's thought to have arrived in the UK in the 1960s from Europe, most likely with narcissus bulbs or plants that were brought over from the continent. And they're not that well recorded, so it would be fantastic if more of us were out there at the minute looking at our narcissus and the daffodils, trying to find this species, get some pictures. There are a couple of doppelgangers, as always. So, really exciting fly. The adults are known to predate on other kind of small flies. And as I mentioned, the larvae, the young, the developing young, they'll be developing on the leaves, the foliage, and sometimes the bulbs, apparently, of daffodils. So I think this is a really exciting species. I will post a picture on Instagram so you can have a little look at it. And please do have a look around your narcissus, around your daffodils, and perhaps even other spring bulbs. You may well see some interesting flies around those too. As always, do record on the apps, on the iRecord app or the iNaturalist app, so we can get those records into the national databases. Really, really important. And I hope you find something cool.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.